All right, I guess we don't have bells again today, or maybe they just forgot to turn it on. Who really knows? You guys are going to want to have your notebooks out. Like I said yesterday, today ought to be pretty brief as far as what we're all doing together. You're briefly going to hit up on some of the notes, some of the stuff that you read yesterday. Yesterday, you read about the Ming Dynasty, a little bit about, the Portuguese showing up in Asia for the first time. You read about the Qing Dynasty. Then you read about Japan and Korea. Japan and Korea, we'll mention just a little bit, especially Japan. We're going to go back and talk about that stuff, kind of their period of isolation in more detail at a later date. Today is mainly going to be about the Ming and the Qing dynasty, and as our learning goal says, how the Portuguese showing up kind of did cause quite a bit of change in Eastern Asia. I got two videos we're going to watch. They're each about 5-6 minutes long. Going to look at some maps, throughout the videos just to kind of expand on some of the points. Again, what we're talking about today goes along with the notes you took yesterday. So if we go over something today that you yourself did not write down, please kind of jot that down. But I'm telling you guys, it's going to be very brief. Once we're done with this portion, I'm going to give you the remainder of the class to do kind of what you need to do. But the first priority needs to be getting your notebook squared away. That is due tonight before midnight. And as I've said, it is a daily grade, but it also averages in with your first notebook check for your final test grade. As far as improving grades, and I know I said the same thing every day, guys, but there's a reason for it. There's always going to be somebody that's like, hey, I had no idea. Nobody told me that. That's why I say the same stuff every single day to make sure that it is annoyingly clear what all you guys got to get done. If you sign up to do the test retakes, those are going to be open through Sunday. Make sure that you get those done. Missing work, everything from notebook check number 1 to now, I'll still accept, but it's not going to be for full credit. At this point, probably about a 55 is as good as you can do. But again, that is way better than a 0, especially on test grades. You also, of course, have your extra credit essay that is going to be Monday before midnight. That is something to seriously consider. Final thing, as far as announcements go, AP exam deposit. If you're going to take this thing and you have not yet made your deposit, it's okay for a little bit longer. But tonight at some point or today at some point, you do need to get that squared away on the total registration website. So where we left off yesterday, you came in. Hopefully you got your bullet point summaries done over this chapter out of the original AMSCO book. Again, if you didn't and you have time, maybe you could finish that up today. But we'll just we'll take that as it comes. So let's start by moving to the east. Let's look at the Ming Dynasty. Ming Dynasty, and they're part of this new time period we're in. Again, we're 1450 to 1750 currently. Lots of changes in the wind during this time period. Everything's really going to change and start to kind of push us in the trajectory of where we are today. Ming Dynasty rule from 1368 to 1644. Who was in charge of China before the Ming Dynasty? The Mongols. Very good. Does anybody remember what their dynasty was called? The Yuan. It's my fault because I pronounce it like different every single time I say it. The Yuan, the Wan, the Yun. But I think you were actually correct. I think Yuan is probably the best pronunciation. So the Mongols have been entrenched there for at that point, quite a while. But, there was always that animosity. The Mongols ruled pretty efficiently, and especially under Kublai Khan, trade was thriving and people were doing all right. But some of his successors, they weren't as tolerant. Maybe they weren't as cool. And especially after the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols try to invade Japan and they don't get the job done. The Chinese start to see, maybe these guys can be defeated. Now, at this point, going into the 1300s, you don't just have cannons anymore. You have actual firearms. You have some of the first handheld guns, which again just kind of evolved over time, in part through Mongolia, but also because, China is the birthplace of gunpowder. In using this new technology, well, the Ming, this group, was able to organize and eventually overthrow the Mongols. So we kind of consider them as a part of that legacy of the gunpowder empires. Again, a lot of the stuff going on during this time period, 1450 to 1750. The unit we're in is called land-based empires. It's these new empires that grew up because they're using firearms. They're becoming proficient in their use. So the Ming force out the Mongols, and kind of what's left of the Mongols at this point end up settling in, what do you know, modern day Mongolia. To keep the Mongols out, the Ming sponsors reconstruction and remending and rebuilding of arguably the most famous landmark in China's history, the Great Wall of China. Now, the Great Wall goes back a long time. It goes back to Qin Dynasty. The first Chinese dynasty that really, kind of gave China its name, really gave them a solid empire to work with. In the years that followed, it had been kind of, fallen into disrepair. It hadn't been used as effectively. One of the reasons it gets reinvested in and rebuilt to some extent and even broadened and strengthened is because, these invaders from the north, the Mongols, other nomadic groups, let's at least make it a little bit more difficult for them to invade. Now, the Great Wall does not surround China, even at this point. But you look in the north, you get down to this area. That's the Gobi Desert. That's a difficult area on its own. It's not that people can't get through there. Some do. We'll talk about the Manchu here in a minute, but it does make it at least a little bit more difficult. So during the Ming Dynasty, things are going pretty good at the beginning. They reinstitute a lot of things that China had been known for. They base their society once again on Confucianism, but it's kind of a slightly newer form known as Neo-Confucianism, which all that is, it's Confucianism, but it does blend a little bit of Buddhism, a little bit of Taoist philosophy into the overall belief system. And again, those are two other belief systems that were also popular in China, even though, Buddhism at least didn't originate there. Again, they're wanting to take things back to how it was before the Mongols, because the Ming, like everybody else, they want to do things to legitimize their authority. They want to do things to get people to follow them and believe in them. And for quite some time, close to 300 years, that's exactly what they did. They reinstituted the old school government structure, the bureaucracy. They reinstituted the civil service testing to get jobs in that governmental bureaucracy that you hadn't seen used as much under the Mongols. Again, it's kind of like a back to basics approach. And because at this point, trade was still thriving based on what the Mongols had done, well, they're doing pretty darn good for themselves. They even invade and broaden their own territory after a time. To give you a little perspective, this is the Ming Dynasty shaded in, and there around it is the modern borders of China. So again, you're starting to see China really take shape. You're starting to see them become a little bit more, what they are today. Now, during this time period, because things are going pretty good, at least for a while, the Ming really start to get that sort of attitude once again that, hey, we are do you remember that nickname we gave China a long time ago? Where everything revolves around them, where they're better than everybody else? You're very close. The something kingdom. Not over here, not over here, right over here. Come on, that was an awesome hint. What was it? The Middle Kingdom. Write that down, guys. China at this point, they go back to that feeling, we are the Middle Kingdom. We are culturally and technologically and economically superior to just about everybody else. And in the early days, the 1300s and early 1400s, it's probably pretty accurate. Again, China's always had that sort of, that sort of attitude, that sort of reputation, that could border on sort of ethnocentrism, feeling like your group, your people are kind of better than everybody else, that everybody else is kind of beneath you. This is the time period that a very famous explorer comes to prominence, known as Zheng He. Zheng He. There was a whole little mini section on him yesterday in your reading. Zheng He. He is one of history's greatest explorers. If he had kept doing what he was doing throughout the 1400s, the early 1400s, who's to say it wouldn't have been the Chinese that discovered the Americas rather than the Spanish? And I say discovered loosely. People were already obviously there. So our first video today is all about Zheng He, how he was a very historically significant individual. And had they continued their activities, I mean, the world will look way different today. So first video is about 5 minutes. It won't take us too long. It's a little old school, but it was one of the better ones I found. It was very comprehensive of who Zheng He was, how he got his job as this sort of admiral, this explorer for the Ming Dynasty, and ultimately just how different things could have been if they would have chosen to keep going on. Watch and enjoy Zheng He. You need to know a little bit about it. And the quality's not like super great. The information is.
During a time of great prosperity and peace in the flourishing garden of Islam, when philosophers and scholars excelled all others in the quality of their writing, and scientists and inventors devised the most marvelous of innovations, adventurers and travelers would go where none of their kind had gone before.
Now you're probably like, why in the world are they talking about Muslims? I thought we were getting into China. Zheng He was a Muslim, yet he was living in China, which goes to show you, especially in the aftermath or during the Mongol conquest, just how much cultural diffusion there was. It's not that China ever had like a huge, Muslim population, but they do grow a fairly sizable population during this time period. You still see that to some extent to this day.
Around the year 1529, Ming Emperor Shizong burned hundreds of logbooks, the final act in destroying evidence of China's supremacy in naval power. Lost for more than 500 years, accounts of a mighty Chinese armada were rediscovered in Fujian province in the 1930s. Etched on a pillar, they told of gigantic ships laden with gifts for distant kings, from whom the Ming Emperor exacted tribute in return. Between 1405 and 1433, the treasure fleet set out on 7 voyages into the unknown. At the helm of these vast armadas was a 2-meter-tall warrior navigator, the Muslim admiral of the fleet, Zheng He. By the end of his final voyage, his fleet had covered over 50,000 kilometers, having anchored in the most famous ports of the time. From China to India, from the Arabian Sea to the east coast of Africa, Zheng He led his ships further than anyone before. Following the religion of Islam, young Zheng grew up in Kunyang, part of the then Mongol Empire. But his boyhood life was to change on his 11th birthday. In 1382, when imperial Ming armies conquered Kunyang, Zheng was and made a eunuch page of a prince, Zhu Di. As fortune would have it, when Zhu Di seized the Chinese throne, Zheng He became his confidant. First rebuilding the Great Wall, Zhu Di then embarked on a massive shipbuilding program and appointed Zheng He as Admiral of the Western Seas, ordering him to go beyond the horizon. Comprising almost 28,000 men and over 300 ships known as swimming dragons, Zheng He's fleets included massive treasure galleons, which were technological marvels of the age. 400 feet long and 160 wide, with 9 masts, they were almost 5 times the size of Portuguese caravels, which had sailed into the Indian Ocean only 50 years later. With a crew of 1,000 men, the ships took enough food to last them for years at sea, and included tubs of earth on deck so that vegetables and fruit could be grown. Beneath were kept the treasures with which to impress their hosts, while within watertight holds, horses were stowed for the cavalry. Zheng He often astonished his emperor by returning with extravagant tributes, of which the most amazing was acquired on his 4th voyage in 1414. In the kingdom of Bengal, Zheng persuaded the ruler to part with an animal given him by an African king. To much excitement, when the giraffe arrived at the imperial court in Beijing, the emperor's philosophers celebrated it as the fabled unicorn, an animal associated with an age of peace and prosperity.
Clearly was
Now
not
a
really
hero,
a unicorn.
Zheng He set sail for his
I didn't know
4th
he
and most ambitious voyage, to Arabia, where he fulfilled his personal pilgrimage to Mecca, and finally reached Africa, stopping at Mogadishu, Mombasa, and Zanzibar. Thought to have traveled as far south as the Mozambique Channel, Zheng He vastly outdid his Western contemporaries in their own age of exploration. Could he have even rounded the Cape of Good Hope and gone as far as America, as some historians claim? But after his death at sea on his 7th and final trip in 1433, a new emperor assumed the throne of the Ming dynasty and began to dismantle Zheng's navy, with the effect that China went from being a superpower into isolation. Yet Zheng He's epic voyages of adventure are remembered by porcelain shards, which still wash up on the beaches of East Africa, and the etchings on the pillar left in a temple signed by the Admiral of the Western Seas.
Kind of wild, the fact that this guy achieved so much and nobody really knows who he is. It's kind of it's one of those things in history. Some people just kind of stand out while others get forgotten about. So Zhang Ha, why is he doing this? Did you guys catch that at the beginning? What would be in this for the Chinese? What's that? Okay, goods. You're establishing further trade relationships. That is part of it. But it's also goods coming in via something other than trade. What's something we talked about that the Chinese did a lot when they thought they were the Middle Kingdom to people around them that they thought were a little bit beneath them?
They made them pay their taxes.
We call that the what system? The tributary system. So here's the mission. Zhang Ha, because at this point the Ming are doing good. They're better than everybody in their mind. They say, we want to go out there and announce to the world just how awesome we are, how rich we are, how powerful we are. We're going to expand trade a little bit, but we also, maybe by showing up on these guys' shores with 300 giant, essentially cruise ships with thousands of soldiers, maybe we can get them to give us stuff. So they're accomplishing a few goals. They're verifying for themselves that they're better than everybody else, which at this point, they visit India and Africa and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And technologically, yeah, they were still a little bit ahead. But they're also expanding that tributary system. Maybe not something that's ongoing where these people got to pay them off every year, but you show up on their shores with all these boats, yeah, they're going to give you giraffes and cool stuff like that, stuff that they never would have seen in East Asia before. So this goes on for years, right? Zhang Ha, Zheng He. I'm telling you, all the stuff in East Asia has multiple pronunciations. We could watch another video and they'd be all Zhang Ha. The thing is, this goes on for what? I'm seeing the earliest dates, 1405, all the way up until, you're talking about 15, 20 years on 7 expeditions, 300 ships in this giant armada. and they're going around and they're expanding the tributary system and they're showing people just how awesome they were. Something like 28,000 people are combined on these 300 ships. It's insane. So they come back, and basically the Ming decide what they thought to begin with was true. They're better than everybody else. So that emperor that sponsored these expeditions, he dies. And even before that, Zheng He, the leader of these expeditions, he dies. And you start to see more of a return to really conservative values. Remember, Confucianism's pretty darn conservative. And basically the new emperor says, well, we discovered we're better than everybody. Nobody really has anything that we need or totally want. So they dismantle all those ships. They make building large ships like that, capable of these huge oceanic voyages, illegal. They start to purposely isolate themselves. In many ways, because they say, hey, we got it good here. We'll still let people come to some areas and trade and buy stuff to us, but it's not like they have anything that we really want, especially in the early days. So they really try to confine trade to one major city, and it expands. But for a long time during the Ming Dynasty, and even later on in the final dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, the Chinese try to confine trade to this city right here. I would write this there. Gongshao, aka Canton. So as traders show up, they're not allowed to just go all over. They're not allowed to get inside of China because, again, they're trying to preserve their culture. They don't want all that outside influence coming in. So Gongshao, Canton, becomes the main port of entry where traders could show up, try to sell some of their goods, but mainly buy Chinese manufactured goods. Now, eventually Macau kind of joins that, but for a lot of history moving forward, for the next couple hundred years, if you're trading, you're not getting much further than the city of Canton, which, you're going to hear Canton mentioned quite a bit. So the Ming are doing their thing, hey, that rhymed, from 1368 to 1644. There's a lot of change going on in that 300 years. And one of the biggest is the rise of the Europeans. Again, we go back to the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. That's really the first tipping of the domino that made Europeans want to find new routes to Asia, want to find new routes to places like China, India, and the Spice Islands and everywhere else. Now, Spain is in this early on, but they're heading this way. And we'll talk about the Spanish later, Columbus, all that. The Portuguese, though, they're even a little bit earlier. And they decide that the smartest thing to do, because, guys, the Suez Canal does not exist at that point, is we're going to finally sail all the way around Africa. The Portuguese tried at one point in 1487 under Porfirio Diaz, but they get to the tip of Africa and they say, whoa, because they almost died getting there. Well, we're turning around, but at least we know approximately how far it is. It's not until a few years later, 1497, 1498, this journey takes a while, that a very famous explorer, Vasco da Gama, makes it all the way around Africa and into India. So now they've actually directly entered Indian Ocean trade. And we're going to go into this later, so I don't want you to get have to get all of it down. But what Portugal starts to do is at these little pit stops along the African coastline, some in India, some in Southeast Asia, they start to build trading posts, these different forts where they can kind of dominate trade in certain areas. Now, Portugal later on will get Brazil in the New World, but you need to know kind of their primary method of empire building during this time period, and this might be worth writing down, was they had a trading post empire. And we kind of looked at some of that the other day when we looked at India when the British showed up. They would have all these posts. And guys, it's in the 1400s that militarily, as far as their navies are concerned, as far as their weapons are concerned, Europeans are starting to advance beyond a lot of these different groups. So they could go in, they could dominate, they could trade with the locals, but they also held strategic points in port cities and choke points that people wanted anyway, that they wanted to go there anyway. But when you showed up, you had to buy license to trade from the Portuguese. That's how they made their money. And that's essentially what a trading post empire is. It's not like they control all this territory, but they did have little outposts that for a time, because militarily they were a little bit more advanced, they could dominate trade in certain regions. I'm gonna tell you what, we're not gonna watch the second video because I want to make sure you guys have plenty of time to at least look over your notebook checks. And guys, if you're missing somebody or something, if there's somebody in here that has those notes, if you guys want to work together, I'm not talking just copying, but if they can talk to you about them and explain them to you, I think that that's valuable enough to where, yeah, you can get some of those notes from some of your peers. I'm trying to help you out. Take advantage of that. If you want to work by yourself, that's fine, but I'm trying to help you. At a certain point, you know, all this self-imposed isolationism, you know, the Ming do fall behind. And a bunch of stuff starts to happen. They have some massive earthquakes. There's crop failures. You know, there's all those sorts of telltale signs that the Ming have lost the mandate ahead. There's peasant rebellions. There's uprisings. There's civil war. It's all messed up. And it's messed up enough to where another group can kind of swoop in and through a lot of shady mechanisms that you read a little bit about, they end up establishing their own dynasty. The final Chinese dynasty, it is known as the Qing dynasty, the Qing, and they'll rule from 1644 to 1911, but they have another name too. And these are used interchangeably, so you need to know both. And they talk about it in the book, so make sure you have it. The Qing equals the Manchu, or the Manchurians. The Manchu, I mean, today you would say, they're Chinese. But you got to understand in China, you know, while it may be hard for us to differentiate, there's all sorts of different ethnic groups, you know, different types of Chinese individuals. In the Ming, you know, they were mainly of the Han ethnicity, whereas the Manchu, they were of the Manchu ethnicity, the Qing. They actually originate from up here to the north of what had been China. And it wasn't like they were the Mongols or anything like that. They were already kind of sort of within the boundaries, but it was kind of a population that all lived together and had some of their own customs. They end up swooping in, you know, just as the Ming are really faltering. And they actually start coming in acting like they're going to help the Ming, and then they take over and it's all theirs. So in a way, the Qing are kind of like the Mongols in that a lot of Chinese see them as outsiders, but culturally they're not quite as different as the Mongols were. And the Qing, they're going to be in power, you know, all the way up until the 20th century, until 1911. One of the big differences is the Qing, unlike the Mongols, they didn't adopt, you know, Chinese culture, even though their culture was pretty much Chinese anyway. They actually wanted to make themselves the dominant forces. They even made Chinese people, you know, that weren't them, get haircuts to look more like them. Sometimes this is called the Peking pineapple. In the book, I think they just call it the Q haircut. I think it's Q-U-E like S or something like that. This is the mandated style. And if you ever watch like some old Kung Fu movies, if you see the people in China, a lot of the men with their kind of head half shaved and they've got like a ponytail, that was part of the deal, you know, and it was a way of showing their loyalty to the Qing. Problem is, much like the Yuan dynasty earlier, there's always that animosity. There's always people that didn't really like it because they were an ethnic minority in charge of a different majority. Couple that with the fact that, you know, they're still kind of trying to remain isolated. Europeans are showing up more and more over time. After a while, it's not just the Portuguese. The fact that, you know, Europeans, especially after the Industrial Revolution, have a whole bunch of stuff they want to sell. So they're showing up in droves and they're kind of competing for more trading privileges. The Qing are going to have a pretty rough time moving forward until they don't really exist anymore. European forces and American forces in the 18 and 1900s actually have a lot to do with that. There's a time where they kind of carve up China into different spheres of influence. It's really, really weird. We're not there yet, but you know that this final Chinese dynasty, you know, the Manchu, They had some disadvantages. And we're going to call that a day. Now, Japan at the same time, really, when the Ming start isolating, they start isolating as well. The Portuguese had dealings with the Japanese early on. The Portuguese actually sell them a bunch of guns. That's how the Tokugawa shogunate takes over. But after a while, much like China, the Japanese didn't like these Europeans coming in with their customs and messing up their stability, like bringing in that destructive force of Christianity. So the Japanese actually completely closed their borders. I mean, there's some areas the Europeans can go off the coast, but Japan becomes very isolated for the next several hundred years. It's not until the 1800s that their borders get opened back up. So for the remainder of class, you've got the last 20 minutes. Woo, I said 20 minutes yesterday. We got 20 minutes exactly. You got the next 20 minutes to do what you need to do. Okay, this is a catch-up time. Someone in here that you know that maybe has some notes that you missed, if you guys want to get together and talk about it. It needs to be more than just, here, copy this. That would be fun. Either way, your notebook is due tonight before midnight. It's going to be a daily grade, but it's also averaging with your first notebook check for your last test grade. So look over, have everything. If there's something you're missing, try to find a way to get it. It's all on Canvas somewhere. If you look at those dates, those are the days that we went over those notes. But it's not like they're just going to be right there, like, here they are, here's notes. You're going to have to do something to get those notes. Maybe go through the book, maybe go through a PowerPoint, maybe watch a video. Again, it kind of depends on how far behind you are. Other than that, do what you need to do. We've got about 20 minutes. If you need anything, let me know. On 1 second. Da-da-da.